Well, we're almost 7 weeks on from the federal election now, and the post-mortem is underway within coalition circles. One suggestion of how to make the party competitive in 2025 has been to adopt gender targets, even if just temporarily, to stem the flow of strong female candidates who are choosing to run as independents against Liberals. Joining me now is one of those MPs who was unseated by a Teal independent, Jason Falinski, former Liberal member for Mackellar. I'm glad you can laugh about it. You've got to have a sense of humour, I guess. What went wrong?
We didn't get enough votes. That's what went wrong. It's simple as that. And I think we didn't get enough votes because, to a certain extent, we were a third-term government going for a fourth term, and we were a victim of circumstances. COVID-19 had made people very irritable. We hadn't been able to run a proper government agenda because we'd been busy saving the nation, both on a health and economic front. And, you know, we got to an election and people went, hey, you know what? It was a bit like a long car trip on a holiday. People just wanted to get out of the car and stretch their legs.
So you're sort of with the Scott Morrison change the curtains. There's a bit more to it than that, though, isn't there?
There was a lot more to it than that, but when you get down to it, I mean, you know, some of the behaviour of the state premiers during COVID, where a lot of the blame was getting shifted to the federal level, even though they were responsible for some of the problems that went on. And, you know, Scott and Greg and Josh didn't feel like it was appropriate in the middle of a health crisis to start playing a blame game, meant that we ended up with an outsized amount of the blame.
Did you underestimate the power of this Teal's independence movement, though?
Mate.
Because you seemed pretty confident of defeating Sophie Scamps in the lead-up. I don't know if that was just spin or you seemed like you thought you had it.
Oh, mate, I never thought. I think probably from about the end of January onwards, so after Australia Day, I really thought that it was we were in trouble. But, I mean, you know, when you've got $2.2 million being spent against you by Climate 200, and I mean, Andrew, with respect, they're not Teals, they're Climate 200. They're part of the Labor coalition government. And the fact of the matter is they spent millions of dollars. And that's before you get to Get Up, before you get to some of the other outside groups that spent millions of dollars to unseat people. And you've got to ask yourself, why did they spend all that money? You know, what's in it for them?
Well, what's your theory on that then?
Well, a lot of them are major investors in renewable energy, companies like 5B, for example, which we know Simon Holmes Accord has an interest in. And it'll be interesting to see what government policy does in terms of redirecting public funds to companies like that.
Why do you think Josh Frydenberg lost? Because he has more of a profile. He seemed quite popular generally across Australia, not like Scott Morrison towards the end. So why did he lose? Just the weight of that money? Yeah,
it wasn't. It was a demographic shift amongst, I think, two groups of people. I think, firstly, the group of people who had been badly impacted by COVID policies, particularly mandates and lockdowns. And that's everyone from small businesses through to people who were nurses, doctors, prison guards. And I think that was half what happened. I think the other half was a group of people, particularly amongst women, who concluded that they really wanted to change for a whole variety of reasons. And, you know, we can go through them, but you've done that quite extensively over the last few years.
What do you think about the future of the Federal Liberal Party from here? Is Peter Dutton the man, and is he right to say target the suburbs and regions?
Mate, he's absolutely right. If I was Andrew Hirst, and I'm not, so he'll come to his own decisions. And I was thinking about where to dedicate resources for the next election. It would be in the outer suburbs and definitely the regions. You know, it makes no sense to try and spend $3 or $4 million against, you know, Simon Holmes Accord and Climate 200 and Get Up and all those groups that spend all that money in these seats.
But if you look at the margins, it's easier to win Higgins or Tangney or even Kooyong, I would say, or even Mackellar than Werriwa. Why isn't it?
Because it's about values and demographics at this point. And what the Liberal Party stands best for is aspiration. And what we have is in places like Werriwa and the outer suburbs, generally speaking, you have a fundamental group of people who aspire to the Australian dream. Arguably, a lot of people in a lot of the seats that we lost have already attained the Australian dream, and therefore they're looking for other policies.
Interesting. So do you think these so-called Teal seats stay with those independents? I know you don't like the term Teal. No,
it's Climate 200. I mean, it's a Labor...
Yeah, but do you think that they win them next time? Most likely.
History shows that unless unless the media is willing to really actually subject these guys to some scrutiny, which they weren't, then what you will end up...
I think a few of us did, but anyway, go on.
Well, no, and that's fair. There were some notable exceptions. But generally speaking, you know, when Anthony Albanese would only give them one extra advisor, the response from news outlets like the Sydney Morning Herald and the Guardian and the ABC was these poor put upon Climate 200 candidates, whereas they're getting one more advisor than most members of Parliament get. Yet reading it, you'd think they only had one person helping them. That's just an example, I think, of the scrutiny that needs to happen. All
right, what do you think of it, quotas? It doesn't serve people like you, you're a bloke, but if you've got 21% of women in the House of Representatives, 21% of Liberals being women, that's pretty appalling, isn't it? I mean, Linda Reynolds is talking about a short-term quota for the Liberal Party.
Yeah, look, my view on this has been consistent and something that I'd really like to be part of, which is that the Liberal Party needs to invest in a candidate school similar to what the UK Conservative Party has. So David Cameron faced actually a much worse situation than we have in Australia, and he was able to turn that around, not just on the basis of gender, but by the way, but on the diversity of experience and merit, and bringing a lot of new people through into the party, and that is through a candidate school and a candidate list. Nicole Flint and I wrote extensively on this. It is something I think has massive benefits and allows you to target emerging groups of people.
But not quotas.
Mate, I don't think quotas solves anything, because you end up in a situation where you end up just putting candidates in seats who don't necessarily have either the experience or the capacity.
Okay.
Yeah, we need to invest in.
But clearly the Liberal Party needs more women. I mean, whether it's done through the method...
mate, I think the Parliament, Parliament generally needs more diversity in terms of background and experience. Okay. At the moment, there are too many people from the professions, union officials, and quite frankly, party officials who sit in the Parliament, and it's not representative of Australia.
All right, we're nearly out of time. Just want to get to you on a couple of things. How much of the loss was to do with Scott Morrison? People's view of him around some of those iconic things, sure, but also the fact he ended up being perceived as not standing for much, not about reform. Do you think that had an impact?
I think that was an outcome of the fact that we'd spent 2.5 years trying to save Australia and hadn't been able to talk enough about a forward agenda.
So you don't blame him for that?
Mate, I think the blame that is ascribed to Scott Morrison is completely and utterly unfair.
Did you see 9 years as an opportunity lost when it comes to economic reform, though?
Yes, I do.
What reforms would you have liked to have seen?
Mate, massive microeconomic reform in tax, in workplace relations, in housing, as you know. And I think also there's a lot of stuff to be done in education. There is an inverse relationship in Australia between education funding and education outcomes.
You had some ideas yourself. One idea was taken up in the final week of the campaign, the superannuation for homes.
Yes.
What was your view of that being taken up at the last minute? Was it a last-ditch desperate thing, do you think?
No, I don't think it was desperate. I understand their rationale for leaving it till the last week. But, yeah, look, it's an example of the problem that we now have in Australia, where there are policy elites in big super, in big unions, in big labour movements that are working against the inimical interests of ordinary Australians.
Is that it for you in politics?
Mate, you never say never, but yeah, I think it is.
And just finally, how do you think Dominic Perrottet will go in March, and will he have this issue with what you call the Climate 200?
No, I don't think he will, because you had spending caps in New South Wales. They haven't run the narrative that they ran against Scott Morrison for 2 years. And I think finally, the cause of liberty has never been more important in Australia. And I think the Albanese Labor government and the coalition government that he has there is about to demonstrate that for all Australians to see.
So you think Perrottet can win?
I think Perrottet will win, absolutely.
Jason Falinski, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.